Hi Team 360, this is Cleo. It is a beautiful day outside, and one thing that I like to do on a beautiful day is to sit and read. So I'm actually sitting outside of where I live, and I'm going to read a little bit of your read aloud to you. You're going to see this over a couple different days, but we're going to start at chapter 1 of Roald Dahl's George's Marvelous Medicine. Like I said, we're outside, so you might be hearing some other voices and other noises too, but I'll do my best to be nice and loud so everyone can hear me. Before we start, I want you to think about what the word marvelous means. If something is marvelous, then it is amazing, fantastic. So George's Marvelous Medicine. There are some pictures in here, and I'll show you after I read. Chapter 1, Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get into mischief. This is a silly thing to say to a small boy at the time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he could get into. I want you to think of what the word mischief might mean. And don't forget to give your grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the door behind her. There's a bug around me. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, said George, and just try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, said George. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there were never children outside to play with. When he was tired, he stared at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as the grizzly old ruin of a grandmother. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. So if George's mom is saying don't get into mischief and behave, those two things would be opposite, right? So mischief is when you don't behave, when you're doing something wrong. You can make a nice cup of tea for start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, said George. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small puckered-up mouth like a dog's bottom. How much sugar do you want in your tea, Grandma? George asked. 1 spoonful, she said, and no milk. Most grandmas are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining and grouching and grumbling and rippling about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, Well, how are you this morning, George? Or, why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or, how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable woman. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoonful of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped on the tea. It was not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in. George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully to his grandmother. Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have a cup without a saucer. A saucer is like a small plate that you'd put your cup on. George fetched her a saucer. And what about a teaspoon, if you please? I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon. George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father was home, Grandmother never ordered George around like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. I meant to show you that picture. It's not colored. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can, she snapped. Growing is a nasty, childish habit. But you have to grow, Grandma. If you didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't grown up any of these things, have you? I'm still only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short, she had to have footstools to put her feet on. And her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy said it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't you listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how am I going to stop growing, George said. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow in the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes off the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's going to be good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And it's got to have caterpillars in it. So much better. Ouch, George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mommy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in there. And slugs, too. Not slugs, George cried out. I couldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beady bugs. You don't know what's good for you. Are you joking, Grandma? I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. I can picture a lot of your faces right now and what it would look like if we were in the classroom, and I think I would have a lot of very confused, disgusting faces. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she says, you can get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in the stick of a raw celery. The old lady went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. I don't want to hear about that, George cried. A big, fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be really quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp snippers on its back, and it grabs your tongue with those. It never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. "You're trying to get away from me, aren't you?" she said, pointing her finger right at George's face. You're trying to get away from your grandma?" Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought that witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't sure. "Come closer to me, little boy," she said, beckoning him with her finger. "Come closer to me, and I will tell you secrets." George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets," she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, and the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. "Come on over here," Grandma said, "and come on over to Grandma, and she'll whisper secrets to you." George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door. "You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma," she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backward. "Some of us," she said, "and all of us." And all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in the throaty sort of voice George had never heard her use before. "Some of us," she said, "have magic powers that can twist creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes." A triangle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. A tingle, not a triangle. He began to feel frightened. "Some of us," the old woman went on, "have a fire on our tongues and a spark in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out of your sockets." George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. "You know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead?" George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him the most. The frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. "We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail," "coming out from behind you." "Grandma," he cried, "stop!" "We know secrets, my dear, about places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. "It doesn't matter how far you run," he heard her saying. "You won't ever get away." George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him.